Sakshi.
Namaste and good evening to people joining from India and good morning for people joining from United States of America. I'm Sakshi Sharda, a researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi. And I extend a warm welcome to you for IMPRI, #Web Policy Talk. We've gathered here for a special talk by Dr. Emily Rains, titled Negotiating Informality, a range of policy needs and problem-solving strategies in urban slums. Under our series, IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, #City Conversations. Moderator for our City Conversation series is Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Viswabharati Santi Niketan, and a visiting senior fellow at IMPRI. He also coordinates the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI. I would now request Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay to take the proceedings further.
Thank you, Sakshi, and a very good evening to all of you from Kolkata. Just before starting, let me just give you a brief background of the City Conversation series and today's talk. And in this City Conversation series, we have been engaging with the urban issues in India, and we have been inviting the experts both from India as well as from abroad to discuss all those issues. And today's discussion is mainly on the slums. And as we know, the slums or informal settlements have been recognized as a global challenge for some time now. And in India, slums represent a mode of urbanization almost equal in significance to urbanization occurring through formal processes of planning. And we all know that there are issues with data definition and non-inclusion of the settlements in official data on slums. If you just look at the census 2011 data, then it shows that 65 million people stayed in slums in the country, which is roughly about 17.4% of urban population in the country. And the conditions of life in the settlements are characterized by insecurity and disparate vulnerabilities, for example, evictions, and that too, despite years of existence and efforts to consolidate their footholds in the city. And languages of encroachment, illegality, and then unauthorizedness, this create an extremely complex relationship with the institutions of the state and the city politics. And slum dwellers, they resort to the varieties of informal practices to gain access to the city resources, and popular and patronage politics, award of selected benefits. We have seen that these have often resulted in conditions of living that are not just poor, but see very little improvements over the years. And essentially, so it is important to understand the nuances of these informal practices in terms of, for example, their nature, their purposes, their mechanisms, and finally the outcomes in terms of spatial and social development. In today's presentation, Dr. Emily Rains plans to discuss the diverse political strategies that the slum residents adopt to solve their problems, and also she will touch upon some of the coping strategies the slum residents have been adopted to combat this current pandemic. And today's the title of her talk is Negotiating Informality, a range of policy needs and problem-solving strategies in urban slums. And just let me just give you a very brief introduction of our today's speaker. Dr. Rain will begin as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Louisiana State University in the next month. And her research interests include in the urban policymaking in developing countries, primarily in India. And in particular, she is interested in how the residents of urban slums, they mobilize politically and how this affects the neighborhood development outcomes. And she has very recently completed her PhD in public policy and political science, dual PhD at Duke University. And prior to beginning her doctoral studies, she worked for 2 years at ID Insight based in Bihar. And so this is the introduction of today's speaker. And apart from that, we have a very eminent panelist today. We have with us Professor Mahalaya Chatterjee, who is the professor of Department of Economics and Center for Urban Economic Studies, University of Calcutta. We have with us Dr. Jenia Mukherjee, who is the assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Science, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. And Mr. Aravind Unni, who is the thematic lead of urban poverty at Indo-Global Social Service Society in New Delhi. And we are also with us Dr. Sarani Khatua, who is the researcher at the Center for Urban Economic Studies, University of Calcutta. So, so now I'm just requesting our today's speaker, Dr. Emily Rains, to start her presentation. So it's over to you, Dr. Rains.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I assume everyone can see that.
Yes,
Yes.
please go ahead, ma'am.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to present today. I am going to be summarizing some findings from a couple different projects that I worked on over time on urban slums in India. And I'm going to talk in particular about, oops, I think I'm going to skip forward. There we go. I'll be talking in particular about some work that I've done on the wide range of living conditions across urban slums, as well as some work that I've done to explain differences in political strategies, the political strategies that residents draw on to mitigate some of the vulnerability that was just discussed. And then because I did say in the blurb that I would focus on the implications for the former work on the ongoing effects and coping strategies that slum residents have been experiencing and turning to during the pandemic, I realized I wouldn't have enough time to touch on all of these things in this presentation. So I'm highlighting here that I've put a bunch of slides on the pandemic in the appendix, and I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion and the Q&A, but I'm going to focus the next 25 minutes on some of the work I've done describing the range of conditions and explaining differences in behavior across slums. Okay, so as was just very eloquently, discussed, we all know that one of the ongoing and growing global challenges, so the world over, to inclusive development and inclusive urbanization is the prevalence of those living in urban slums, and in particularly the extent to which these populations are disconnected from important resources that we know are crucial to human development outcomes. And so the United Nations estimates already that nearly 1 billion people live in urban slums around the world, and that this number is going to continue to increase as urbanization increases. And they define slums as areas that have limited access to property rights, so insecure housing rights, as well as inadequate service access. And in India in particular, in India alone, they estimate that over 100 million people live under these conditions. Also, as mentioned in the introduction, we know that slums are neighborhoods that not only experience high levels of poverty, but also multiple forms of informality or multiple disconnections. So in particular, the slums are characterized to varying degrees by the lack of access to secure property rights or formal housing documents, as well as adequate municipal provided infrastructure. So those are things that factor into the United Nations definition of slum area. But slum residents also often lack identity documents, those necessary to access benefits like rations, despite living in the city for decades at a time. We also know that most slum residents work in the informal economy. So they tend to work in positions that don't offer government benefits and can be very precarious with respect to wages as well as job security. And so each of these aspects makes life in slums very volatile or insecure. Residents don't necessarily know day to day, right, whether they will be evicted, whether or not they're going to have access to adequate water, whether they'll be able to access rations needed to supplement their diets, or whether they'll be able to get enough work. So this makes life in slums very volatile and insecure, and leaves residents highly vulnerable to shocks, making it not only difficult to experience upward mobility, but also really susceptible to downward shocks and downward tugs consistently. And so I mentioned that the United Nations estimates that over 100 million Indian citizens live in slums, which again, they define as an area that is characterized by at least one of 5 different indicators. inadequate access to safe water, inadequate access to sanitation, poor quality housing, overcrowding, and insecure tenures, insecure property rights. But in part because the Indian government adopts a stricter definition with minimum numbers of households required to constitute a slum, and also because of bureaucratic ambiguity, infrequent updating. For various reasons, the lists of those living in slums are incomplete. They omit many people. And so again, as was mentioned in the introduction, a recent official estimate by the Indian government is that 65 million Indian citizens live in urban slum areas, whereas the United Nations has this at tens of millions more. So there's severe undercount of those living in slum areas. And unfortunately, much of the undercount is omitting the most vulnerable of these settlements. So in order to better understand the living conditions and policy needs across slums, one project that I've worked on over time with colleagues over several years is to look outside of official data sources to try to build our own sample of Indian slum areas. And so we actually used satellite images. So we turned to manual analysis of Google Earth images, and we started iterating between looking at Google Earth images and conducting ground truth verifications to come up with a list of criteria that are visible in Google Earth images that can be used to locate slum settlements. And so we did this in order to try to develop our own sample that we consider to be representative of slums across 3 different cities: Bangalore, Jaipur, and Patna. And so here what I'm showing you is a settlement in Bangalore. And this is a settlement that on the left from the ground that the residents have been living in the city for decades, but this is not documented in any official data source. And then on the right, I'm showing you that settlement from the sky. That's the Google Earth image where it's actually very easily detectable. And so what we found through this iteration over several years between looking at these images and conducting ground truth verifications is that there are 5 characteristics that are visible from Google Earth that are predictive of an area being a slum settlement. And in this image, you can actually see all of those characteristics, which are that it's highly crowded, it's haphazardly arranged, so it's not built around a clear grid-like structure. There's no shadows, which indicates that the buildings are very low, they're not tall. And the roof, there's no roads, was what I was going to say. And then also the roofs are a distinctive color because of the material. Here they're made from tarp, and that's very visible in this image. Now, we were able then to identify a wide range of settlements across cities that look quite different as well. So I mentioned that there are those 5 characteristics that we find that are predictive of an area being a slum settlement. But while the settlements like the one I just showed you or the one on the left here display all 5 of those characteristics, other ones like the one on the right are also slums, but don't display as many of those characteristics. So this one, it has different color roofs. It looks like there are roads present. And so there are fewer of those characteristics visible. This slum is a bit more well off, but we're still able to detect that this is an irregular settlement. And so over time, we mapped a wide range of these settlements identified through the images across these 3 cities that I mentioned. And we selected random samples in each of the cities that preserved the spatial distribution of the slums throughout the city, as well as the distribution of these visible characteristics from the images, so that we could select a sample of slums that, again, we believe to be a representative sample of the characteristics of the slums in each of those 3 neighborhoods. Of those 3 cities. And so we then went into those settlements over several years and conducted over 9,000 household surveys, asking about settlement histories, asking about policy priorities, local needs, and the strategies that residents draw on to try to improve or reduce vulnerability in their neighborhoods across more than 200 slums in those 3 cities. I've also conducted in-depth structured interviews with 150 slum residents, and we've had many more conversations with informally with residents. And then we've done a couple follow-up studies that were focused on specific inquiries, like we did something on housing markets in Bangalore, and then we've done some follow-up work looking at the effects of the pandemic. So in order to first try to understand the range of policy needs across these spaces, we actually at first applied machine learning techniques to all of that household data that we'd collected to try to see if slums seem to cluster into distinct types or distinct groups that might have distinctive policy needs. And we actually found that rather than clustering into distinct groups, we found that slums across these 3 cities were ranged across a incrementally improving continuum of living conditions. So we didn't find distinctive clusters of slums, but instead we found that living conditions improved incrementally along a very wide-ranging continuum. And what I'm showing you here is just the score that we created to quantify how well off these slums were relative to one another. And so what we did was we looked at the United Nations indicators, so the water quality access, the sanitation access, the durability of housing and crowding, and then created an index with these indicators to just rank or to quantify how well off that slum was. So we called it the slum score, which is an index of those indicators. And all I'm showing you here is just the slum scores in increasing order. So this is just to show you that there are no huge gaps in scores. What we're seeing is continuous increase pretty much in these slum scores. But there's a couple things I want to point out in this figure that I think are important. The first is that the living conditions associated with different parts on this continuum are quite dramatically different. So for the bottom quartile slums, the average, not the average, but we find that from the household survey data, only 10% of the households in the bottom quartile have cement roofs, these sturdy roofs. About 13% have said that they have access to toilets. And when we ask about a set of 20 common assets, on average, they own less than 4 of them. When you look instead at the top of this continuum, you see a very different picture. So in the top quartile, actually, we find that about 80% of households have cement roofs, about 80% have toilets, and out of those 20 assets, they hold over 8. So what we're trying to capture here is that the living conditions vary quite substantially across this continuum. Another thing that I want to point out about this figure is that you can see a little bit about the difference in distribution of living conditions across cities. So Bangalore is listed here, or is shown here in blue, Jaipur is in red, and Patna is in green. And so you can see that slums in Patna tend to cluster along the bottom of the continuum. They tend to be less well off relative to the other 2 cities. But interestingly, there are slums at the very bottom of this continuum in Jaipur and Bangalore as well. So the distribution of conditions is different across the cities. And then across this continuum, I want to highlight as well that these different types of informalities that I mentioned, so the quality of housing documents, identification documents, services, and the type of work residents are engaged in are also quite different. So you would see more at the bottom of this continuum, much greater informality or disconnections from these different types of resources, and these are increasing across this continuum. So I want to transition now a little bit to talking a bit more about politics in these spaces. Existing research shows that access to these resources, so as I just mentioned, housing documents, identification documents, municipal infrastructure, can be intensely political. So here I'm citing a couple people who are noting that, the infrastructure, if we're thinking about water or sanitation, it can be prohibitively expensive for slum residents to self-provision. Some of these other resources are impossible to self-provision if you're looking at trying to get access to a ration card, a government document. And so in turn, lots of scholars have discussed that urban slum residents will be left to politics to try to negotiate with politicians to try to access these types of resources in the absence of being able to self-provision them. And so I like this quote from Gabby Crooks-Wisner, who says, access to services in this sense is best understood as a matter of who can extract them from the political system. It is, in other words, a matter of who makes claims on the state. So I think it's really important then to study political behavior in these spaces to understand who's then better able to access some of these important resources that are missing in slum areas. Now, what does this look like in urban slums? Well, often the political strategies that residents draw on to try to negotiate for improvements and improved resources are described as collective. So often described as groups going to politicians or leaders to ask for resources in their community targeted at the community level, so group level coordination. They're often described as mediated, meaning that slum residents will go through a local leader or a broker who will liaise on behalf of their neighborhood or liaise between politicians and their neighborhoods to negotiate for improvements to the area. These are often called the informal leaders or brokers of the area. And that a lot of these negotiations are described as transactional as well. So the idea being then that that leader would say, if you give us X, we'll give you our votes. And this is what's often described as vote banking, right? The idea being that neighbors would agree on a material resource or a material good to prioritize and have an intermediary meet with politicians on their behalf and offer to exchange their votes in return for that good. And this is something that's well documented in academic literature, but also something that's just discussed and described by the slum residents themselves, right? So here's a quote from a slum resident in Bangalore who says, well, the vote bank here is the main thing. If we vote for Congress, they'll listen to us. If we approach them with problems, they get it done. They remain the same during elections and after the elections. If we approach them with problems, they get it done to the extent possible for them. So this discussion of this type of collective mediated transactional exchange is quite common overall. And a growing body of research looks at the neighborhood characteristics that are associated with receiving a favorable response from these types of requests. So there's some work that shows that state support tends to be extended to the neighborhoods that have stronger informal networks. So they're more organized, they have denser social networks, they're more organized or cohesive at the neighborhood level, but also might have denser networks of these brokers or informal leaders, so these more efficacious informal leaders. Pause to take some coffee. Now, these studies, though, tend to not discuss differences in whether neighborhoods are making requests at all or how they're doing so in the first place, which we should expect also to affect, of course, which neighborhoods are getting what. So there's not as much work looking at whether and how slum residents are entering into these types of negotiations with politicians. And this is something that in studying a wide range of slums over time, I found that whether and how residents do turn to politicians to negotiate does vary substantially across settlements. Here, I'm again showing you two different settlements where I have conducted interviews in Bangalore. The first one on the left is the one I showed you before, which has been there for 20 years, but is not documented in any official lists. And there, residents actually largely do not make claims. They don't engage in these political strategies to try to negotiate as a vote bank. Instead, they say, well, we can't really do that. When we ask them, why don't you go negotiate for water, et cetera, they say, well, we're not part of the city. The city dwellers get those facilities, but our people don't. And so there's abstention in that neighborhood from making these demands. On the right is a different neighborhood that actually formerly looked a lot like the one on the left, but was over time selected for in situ upgrading. And there, residents describe themselves as these adept political negotiators and describe this very systematic process, this systematic vote bank process, where they say, well, they start the process 15 days to a month before the election. And then the people here come together as a united front and say, here's all the things we want for our area. If you can get them done, we'll put our vote for you. And in this area as well, other residents have talked about also going around their area leader in smaller groups and asking for more individualized services. So quite different story between these two settlements. And explaining why we see different strategies and behaviors engaged in across settlements is something that I've been working on in recent research. And so something that I've been looking at recently so this is something I've been looking at recently, and what I've been arguing, or what I argue, is that slum neighborhoods vary or are characterized by two important dimensions that can explain quite a bit of the differences in the strategies that residents draw on to negotiate for improved resources or reduced informalities. And the first is their access to formal resources. So here I'm on the x-axis showing neighborhood formality. And here I'm referring to the same dimensions that I've been discussing throughout this presentation, which is whether or not and the extent to which the residents have access to housing documents, to identification documents, to government provided quality infrastructure, and also to the types of occupations that residents tend to work in. And so there's a big spectrum there's that whole continuum of the degree to which settlements are connected to these different resources, or the extent to which they're accessing these formal resources, which I think is one dimension that I am going to be talking about. But then another dimension that's important for understanding which strategies residents engage in is the strength of their informal networks. And this is something that I mentioned other people have been studying for quite a while. So here I'm referring to internal neighborhood cohesion, so cohesion amongst the neighbors, but also the presence and strength of the informal leaders, as well as the informal leaders' connections to politicians externally. And so I'm arguing that these two dimensions affect neighborhood priorities. So what goods or services residents are going to prioritize trying to negotiate for, as well as political beliefs, and then as well as the extent to which neighbors are encouraging one another to mobilize. And in these three ways, these two dimensions shape the political priorities the political strategies that residents turn to. So at a very high level, to show you what I mean by that, I'm showing you here what I believe the relationship, or what I find the relationship between this neighborhood formality and political behavior to be. So on the x-axis here, I again have this neighborhood formality variable. So this is a big spectrum, the degree to which residents have access to those various resources that I've mentioned, services, documents, etc. And on the y-axis, I have the extent to which they're engaging in, on this curve, group level strategies, and in this curve, individual level strategies. So what I mean by that is the group level strategies, are they engaging in this type of vote banking behavior where they're going as groups, often through intermediaries, to make demands either by protesting or by offering to exchange votes for the good, but participating in this group level, or in this group often through the neighborhood leader is what I'm referring to there. The individual curve, what I mean by that is whether or not residents are going directly, either by themselves or in smaller special interest groups, to politicians or bureaucrats to negotiate for specific sub-neighborhood level resources. And so what I'm showing you here is that at very low levels of neighborhood formality, so where there's no documents, no services, and workers are employed in extremely precarious occupations, I find that slum residents actually have very limited political efficacy. So they tend to describe that they do not have confidence that they would be able to approach the state and ask for these various goods that they want, but they also don't believe that the state will respond even if they go. So the political beliefs or the political efficacy is quite limited, and engagement is depressed as a result. And that really is describing what's going on in the settlement I showed a few slides ago, where they say, well, we're not the city, we're not going to try for that because they're never going to respond to us. At higher levels of neighborhood formality over here, we see higher levels of collective efficacy. So in these neighborhoods, residents are much more likely to say that they feel confident going as a group, going as a neighborhood, or going through their leader, their local leader, to negotiate for goods. And they also are much more likely to believe that if they do something like that, not only are they capable of it, but that politicians or the state are going to respond favorably. And so that's one mechanism. Another is that at this level of resources, residents still have need for or use for vote banks to negotiate for collective goods. So things like connecting the whole settlement to piped water or drainage. And so as a result, you see these higher levels of this group type of organizing in these spaces. And then at these this much higher level of neighborhood formality, where slums are beginning to look very similar to lower middle income neighborhoods that are perhaps indistinguishable from slums. As you get at that higher level of formality, you start to actually see an increase in residents' individual efficacy. So that's when you start to see residents describing that they believe they, by themselves or in smaller groups, are capable of confidently engaging with the state, going directly to politicians to ask for subgroup or special interest goods, and be more likely to believe that the state might actually respond to them. And so between that and having already met many of the collective group needs, you start to see more of a shift towards individual or subgroup level strategies. Now, adding in that second dimension of the stronger informal networks, what I'm essentially showing here is that for a given level of neighborhood formality, areas with stronger informal networks where there's greater neighborhood cohesion and stronger and more efficacious leaders with stronger connections to politicians, you're going to see the group level coordination, this protest or offering to exchange votes for goods type of activity shifting upwards. And that's in part because collective efficacy is also higher in these spaces. People in neighborhoods with stronger informal networks are more likely to expect a favorable response from politicians, as well as to expect their neighborhoods capable of making an effective claim. But also you're more likely then to see neighbors encouraging one another or mobilizing one another to participate. And one other thing that I want to point out here is essentially what this graph is also showing is that for very low levels of formality, these informal networks are pretty much a prerequisite to the area engaging politically. All right, so I think this is important because whether and how residents negotiate with the state or demand, make claims, as Gabby Crooks-Wisner says, try to extract these resources from the state, whether and how people do this is going to have implications for which places and which residents get which type of goods. And so I, just talked about this, what I think is going on here, that these two neighborhood characteristics are shaping political beliefs, whether residents are mobilizing one another and the types of goods that they're prioritizing in ways that shape the types of claims they make on the state or the demands they make on the state. Then, of course, once one decides whether and how to engage, the state's going to decide whether and how to respond. And so there's going to be this feedback loop where, depending on how the state responds, the neighborhood characteristics update at the next period, and you enter into this feedback loop. And so something that I'm working on right now and in some of my ongoing work is looking at unpacking this feedback loop in order to try to better explain development trajectories across different slum areas. So to summarize, as was mentioned in the introduction, there are severe data deficits on and undercounting of slum residents, and much more information is needed on and attention to slum areas, absolutely. But we also know, and what I've worked on over time and just presented at a very high level, is that the living conditions in urban slums and the level of disconnections that residents experience varies substantially across settlements, and actually varies more across than within settlements. In the absence of access to adequate supports or adequate resources, informal political negotiations that residents turn to try to access these different resources are very important to understanding who ends up getting what, but whether and how residents actually do mobilize varies substantially across settlements. And so I think this will have really important implications for development, again, at the household and neighborhood level, which is something that I'm working on showing more fully going forward. So I'm going to stop there. I think, like I said, I have some slides on some work I've done recently on the pandemic, and would be happy to talk about that in the discussion, or of course, much more detail on any of these high level projects that I've just presented. But thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Rains, for your very interesting presentation. Yeah, absolutely. This is a very important topic, that the research that you are carrying on these Indian slums. And as you started out your presentation, that the multiple informalities that characterize the slums in India, and of course that we know very little about the slums and their informalities. And you have shown that the living conditions of the slums, they vary quite substantially along the continuum and among the cities surveyed, which you have surveyed, the 3 cities that you have surveyed. And also you have highlighted that the slum dwellers, they explore the different political channels to make claims on the urban resources which are missing or inadequate in the slum areas. And you mentioned about the these sort of political clientelisms, which are extremely important in helping the slum dwellers to make their claims to the urban resources. And there you mentioned about the importance of the neighborhood characteristics as well as the characteristics of the slum dwellers themselves. For example, you have talked about the lack of proper documents and how they are affecting or shaping the political power to negotiate with the leaders or with the state in order to claim their resources. And also you have mentioned that the neighborhood formality and the strength of informal networks, how these 2 important dimensions shape the political strategies that the dwellers are undertaking. So, and it's very nice. There is a very interesting graph, and where you have shown that at a lower level of informality, where slum dwellers without have any documents, they also lack political efficacy. So, of course, and that's make their conditions much more vulnerable. They are the most vulnerable section of the among the slum dwellers. So, and also you have mentioned that the stronger informal networks, and from there you the importance of stronger informal networks or the presence of influential leader at a specific given level of neighborhood formality, that critically also shape the livelihood conditions of the slums. And it's really important. So now thank you again once again for your very interesting work. So I have some of my queries, so I will place them later on. But before that, just to take this discussion forward, so let me now request our discussant to comment on your presentation. So may I now request Professor Mahalaya Chatterjee, if you, ma'am, if you please come and share your thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Shomodip, for me, and thank you, Dr. Rains, for this interesting talk. Actually, I would like to point out 2 or 3 things. This is a very interesting thing, and you have surveyed 3 Indian cities of 3 different type of characteristics. Patna being in Bihar, in one of the least developed states, and their slums are quite different from what can be found in one of the most advanced states of Karnataka in Bengaluru, and Jaipur being a middle ranking. Rajasthan is again a backward state, but Jaipur being its capital and Jaipur having some historical historical importance and being a tourism state, the slums are quite different of that. So I am not going into that. I would like to point out 2 or 3 things. Actually, I come from a city in which the slum networks are most strong, and not only today, but from a long time. And that has, of course, that has a history behind it, because here the so-called slum politicization and the networking started long ago. Long ago, maybe just in the 50s. In the 50s, so our experience with slum networking, networks, their political negotiation, the strength of their political negotiation is quite different from what can be found in other Indian cities. But it should be pointed out that you have rightly pointed out that when the slum dwellers are in a difficult state, when their formality condition is very low, and they are not in a state to negotiate and others. But here, I would like to know from you that what is the status of the slums you have surveyed, because that is the main point of contention in Indian data system or anything. Here we have three types of slums: the registered, recognized, and identified. The registered are recognized, which you have actually pointed out that some slums do not come under any official record. So those are the slums which we know that they are slums, and only the census authority count them again with their own set of parameters as identified slums. The slums which come under recognized and registered, they are basically which are recognized by law. One is by the central slum clearance law, which was passed way back in 1956, and other is by the state laws. In 2010, there was a project which was related to this Rajiv Awas Yojana, which tried to make India slum-free or zero slum city by 2020. And now we are talking about in 2021 about the informality, the networks and other things in for Indian slums. And 2011 census data shows that there are slums. Once upon a time, it was thought that slums are supposed to be some intermediate sort of things, where poor people, the migrant from the rural areas, they come and stay there. And as their income increases, they will go on to some formal housing. But 2011 census data clearly shows that that is not the scene. That is not the scene. All the cities and towns, where every size class, they have slums, and in some smaller slums, we are ashamed to have about 30% of people, 30 to 40% of the people in the metropolitan cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata living in slums. But some of the smaller towns even have 90 to 100% of their population living in slums. So it's a matter of shame. And the point is that why these people have to negotiate, why they have to build up so-called informal networks to get their due. They are citizens. They are citizens. They are entitled to have all the facilities of the citizen. And the pandemic has shown that they are the main labor force of the city, which do all sorts of informal works, informal jobs which are necessary for the ongoing of the city. This is really deplorable that they have to go for this type of things. I would just end up by at least for this. I would like end up by saying some experience from my own city. As I have said, that we have a very long history of building networks and others. Calcutta or Kolkata faced something after in 1947 when the country was partitioned. There's a huge flow of refugees from at that time is Pakistan. And when they came, of course, the pressure, most of them came. It's not that they came to Kolkata only, but most of them came to Kolkata, and there was a huge pressure on the on the land in and around Kolkata to accommodate this refugee population. And at that time, most of the owners of the land for these slums, they were, they took, wanted to take that advantage, and they wanted to eradicate all these slum dwellers. And there is a long history in and there was a Slum Clearance Act was centrally passed in 1956, and in 1958 itself, the West Bengal government, then West Bengal government, they wanted to implement that law in Kolkata also. Of, they did not mean West Bengal, because other cities and towns in West Bengal at that time did not have those much of that much of slums. And there is a and when this Slum Clearance Act was being discussed in the our legislative assembly, West Bengal Legislative Assembly, there was a procession of more than 5,000 people from the slums towards the legislative assembly, protesting against their eviction and all those things. That was the first time that not only individual slum dwellers, but all the slums in the city of Calcutta, at that time the city of Calcutta, they came together to protest against this Slum Clearance Act. That is the first time, and that is how, and they also fought in the state election under this under a banner called United Citizens Forum. So way back in 1950s, they claimed their right as the citizen. Citizen. Well, after that, say many years have passed, and there was the Kolkata Bosti Federation, Calcutta Bosti Federation, but that was not that active. But they were reunited again as Calcutta Bosti Federation in this 1979. 1979, the Calcutta Bosti Federation was reborn, and of course, that was being helped by the left-front government that was in power at that time. I'm not going into that long history, but just to say that this Calcutta Bosti Federation, it took a major role in lots of legal negotiations and lots of other issues. At one time, as you know, the Kolkata Metropolitan Development Authority, it was a pioneer in the in situ development of slums. Rather than going for slum clearance and demolition of slums, they go in for in situ negotiation. And each and every slum of Kolkata at that time, there was a smaller component of this Kolkata Bosti Federation, and they did the negotiation with CMD authorities, and I remember attending 2 or 3 meetings in late 80s or early 90s with the KMD officials. I remember, and there I would like to bring in another point, that is a gender point. When we looked at the females in the slums, they were the most vocal about their problems. They knew everything. The which tap is not having water, which drain is clogged, and everything. Everything. So that is another dimension, and I was surprised. I was then, of course, somebody coming out for university without very not much ground level experience about these things. I was surprised at the conviction with which these female Bosti dwellers spoke with the KMD officials. KMD officials, and of course, with changing times, their role also changed. Role after they also built up some sort of data with the maintenance of the slums. The KMDA could renovate the slums, but they took no responsibility for the maintenance and others. That part was taken up by these branches of this Kolkata Bosti Federation. And one of the very leading roles, I should say, and their network is spread not only in these recognized and the so-called registered slums, but also in the so-called identified slums. And in the very recent days, say in the last part of 2019 or 2020, when we have a bridge, very important bridge connecting the northern part of the city with the suburb, that is the Tala Bridge. the Tala Bridge was planned to be demolished because it lost its it was thought to be lost its so, and this Tala Bridge, below this Tala Bridge, there are about 1,000 people living in an unrecognized slum. And in this Bosti Federation, by that time it has changed its name. It's no longer called the Bosti Federation, but it is Poshchim Bongo Bosti Unnayan Samiti. It took a leading role in arranging the rehabilitation of almost all the households, all the people living there before the demolition could take place. That is one sort of that is one very important example. And this Poshchim Bongo Bosti Unnayan Samiti is now not confined in Kolkata only. It is spread to in each and every statutory town in West Bengal. So this is one is something I say, that not only negotiating about their daily needs like water, like drainage, like light within the slums, then the streets within the slum. So one of the point of slum improvement was having paved roads within the slum. Not only all these things, but also this this fight against the eviction, that was also part of this networking and others. So I should stop
Okay.
here.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you, ma'am, for making some interesting points about some fundamental points, rather, I should say, that regarding the right to the city, who are the citizens, and if they are rightfully the citizens, they have the right to live in the city, so they do not have to resort to this kind of political clientelism. Just being a citizen, they should have access to all the facilities which they should enjoy to lead a very decent life. So, well, thank you. I think Dr. Rains will respond to that. But before that, let me just have all the discussants' point of view so that it will be easier for you to respond to all the points which have been raised by our discussion. So now let me just move over to Dr. Jenia Mukherjee for your comments. Yeah, it's over to you, Dr. Jenia.
Thank you, Shomodip sir. Thank you, Mahalaya ma'am. And of course, thanks a lot, Dr. Emily, for this very nice presentation. And, you know, it was quite lucidly explicated. So I could really understand that you you went through a lot of data. You also developed your own data sets, which I think I would appreciate a lot. Because, like, for example, all of us know that that slums remain undercounted. There is, no confusion on this fact. But the way you use the methodology, I find your methodology to be quite innovative, because I think you have kind of triangulated, you use the word reiteration, but I think I would also be happy to use triangulation and also maybe cross-fertilization of methods and methodology, which is actually my favorite as well. So what I like about your methodology is that how you have used Google Earth, so GIS, innovative GIS maybe, and then you have kind of fed the data from the field finding. So kind of you have combined this GIS with quantitative data sets, I guess so. So this I think is quite interesting. But two complementary questions or comments in terms of this is, one is, after seeing your presentation and listening to your key points, I feel little provoked to again kind of complicate the ontology of slums. So what are slums exactly? So how do we also make this differentiation between slums and squatters and busties, because there are some indigenous terminologies as well. So for example, if you also see, because the Indian context is so very diverse and complex. So like, for example, so what we mean by slums, is it absolutely, or if can we really use basti? So is basti kind of a replaceable term? Again, I think I came across a report, which is an interesting report by Nitai Kundu, again on Kolkata. And this was published in 2005. And this was on slums versus squatters. And there he pointed out that, slums, their tenurial security is still even more better secure than the tenurial security of the squatters. because he made the distinction on the basis of access to land deeds. So, for example, he said that for the slum population, the households, they actually had land deeds with them, which and it made the job of the statecraft difficult. If when the state actually wanted to kind of implement displacement or eviction rights against the implementation of any development project for that matter. But on the other hand, the squatters people, so they kind of lacked access to land deed for sure, but they had the voters card. So it is absolutely assured that they of course were used in this vote bank politics. So they were of course part of this vote bank politics, and this is nothing new because we of course know the works by Joseph Gugler and Mike Davis, who talk about how these people actually have been used as pawns in this entire politics on vote bank. So I would also like to know from you, this ontologies. Or how do you actually define slums, and how do you differentiate between slums and squatters and other indigenous terms that you have actually come across while doing this survey on these 3 cities? And I'm sure that information on these 3 cities also make your position stronger, because you then can make some typologies, and you are better positioned to do or to engage into comparative research or comparative ontological understanding. So my final comment is like, I mean, of course, the points or the arguments that came across, that came up in your presentation about infrastructural injustice, maybe. So you talked about lack of infrastructural access or issues relating to infrastructural access. I think I can be more straightforward to introduce the term injustice and say, of course, infrastructural injustice. And when I use injustice, then definitely I would also maybe would like to know from you, or maybe inform you with the like environmental justice or political ecology literature that is there, that actually talks about this this lack of or unequal distribution or unequal access to urban utilities for that matter. So I think political ecology scholarship, or the recent urban political ecology scholarship, especially on Indian cities, it's really it's quite comprehensive, and it has developed so well in the last 15 years. So I would definitely encourage you to go through works by especially people like Malini Ranganathan, because Malini Ranganathan talks about these water mafias in Bangalore. I'm sure you must have come across her work. And apart from Malini Ranganathan, I think there are different other works as well. But I think Malini Ranganathan can be the most appropriate, because you are also concentrating on Bangalore. So just the final thing is that I also enjoyed, like Shomodeep said, I enjoyed your graph, and this you talked about, because it was quite clear and evident the formal informal because you address the formal informal intersections. And so I think again there is a literature on infrastructural injustice by urban scholars like Adriana Allen and Karen Becker on architecture infrastructural archipelagos, where they show that where there is lack of policy driven initiatives, how needs driven initiatives are actually kind of emerging in these urban spaces. But then this story also needs to get complicated, because if we say that where there are lack of policy driven needs, there are needs driven initiatives, but that does not solve the problem, because it is important to map in details the intra power asymmetries even within a slum. And this entire story of power asymmetry or power hierarchy is also very much gendered. And there are of course class, caste, ethnicity, gender. These are all the various dimensions that also need to be taken into consideration when we are we are kind of focusing on even one slum. So each slum, I think, has its own narrative. So I think your study is very provocative because it kind of unpacked so many questions from multiple avenues. So all the best, and yeah, I think I'm looking forward to your comments
Thank
on
you.
this point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jenia, for making some very interesting and fundamental points. Like, and absolutely. And another point, just to add to you whatever you have said, like if you understand, if you want to, we want to understand the informality in the context of the Indian slums, then I think another way of looking at informality is to a state of deregulation, which is very much important, because informality in the Indian context is very much fluid in nature. Fluid in nature in the sense it is a kind of ever shifting, like relationship between what is legal and what is illegal, because just Dr. Jenia has talked about the power asymmetries, and that is gendered nature of power asymmetries, and how the power asymmetries are also shaped and informed by caste, religion, and also religion is also a big factor. So depending on all that, the entire idea of informality is also very much fluid. That means from one point of view, from one perspective, one specific approach may be considered as legal, but from the same for some other person that may be considered as the illegal. Okay, so it's a completely fluid concept. It may be informality. We can think of a state of deregulation that might be an useful framework. And also you have talked about Dr. Jenia has talked about many other things, and another important theoretical aspect might be the occupancy urbanism by Solomon Benjamin. So that might be the very much useful concept for understanding the vote bank politics, which you are talking about. So with this comment, let me now move over to Mr. Aravind Unni, who has the experience of doing some very good on-good research. So he has been researching for the last couple of years. So it's over to you, Aravind, for your comments. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Soumyadeep, for the introduction. I would be commenting on the wonderful research that Emily has done from more of a practice side also, and also as someone who's dabbling with research every now and then again. So and some pointers for us to also think over and think and reflect on such a very important subject and a topic that you've selected. So firstly, there are four or five comments to initiate the discussion. Comments / questions to you, and we can take them up as we kind of go along. So I've been working with slums and the issue of informal settlement for the last around 10 years now with communities, and I'm speaking from that experience. Might be differing from others. So yeah. So first is that the approach of what triggered and what was very interesting also is the approach of beginning with this research of how you look at informal settlements, and that too to use a Google Earth image, which can be very tricky, and it is something that when we are working in the community is something that we usually don't do. Why so is look at Bombay. During rains in Mumbai, most of the houses will have plastic on top of their roofs. Look at Kolkata. So to look at slums from their aesthetics and to then enter that it's a slum, that can be really challenging, because the point that Soumyadeep just mentioned before I kind of got in is that there is very little distinction between what is a slum now and what was a slum yesterday and what is it going to be tomorrow. So if we were to apply the definitions of slum being something that's not habitable, I'm sure 90% or 95% of Indian cities would qualify as slums. So the whole debate of looking at informal settlements and then to kind of initiate the whole inquiry was very interesting, but something that was little very interesting to begin with. So that was the first point that I had to make, and a very brave kind of decision to take also. So I would be very curious to know, Emily, of why did you kind of went into that. Second point was that I think when you select different cities and contexts, what really happens is that, like, again, referring to what Jenia said just before, is that every settlement is different. And when you do it at a scale of selecting 3 cities and very, very different cities, that becomes really further complicated because you have different set of policy parameters and you have a different set of policy, I won't say policy, you have a different set of polity in that city. The politics of Kolkata is very, very different from what happens in Delhi. It's again very different from what happens in Bangalore. So what really complicates matters then is that the slum may be 20 years old, but if it's in a city like Delhi, and if it's come about even in 2015 or just after 2015, that might not be legal. But if it were Bombay, so there are these different cutoff dates. There are these different landowning agencies that have different cutoff dates. So there are these different parameters that are wholly dependent upon many conditions that determine why the settlement is the way it is. And politics, I think, plays a major role because in spite of all the movement that Professor Mahalaya made, I don't think that West Bengal as of now has a policy or a framework to give land or to give land titles to informal settlements in West Bengal. Ma'am, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is from what I've heard and experienced. But we know that slums will not be evicted and demolished in West Bengal because that is the polity there. That is the politics that is very peculiar to West Bengal. At least at this stage, we don't know what will happen in future. So that was my second point. Third is that that every community is different, and probably the reasons of, other than ones that you mentioned of, definitely informal networks play a huge role in how the community develops. Who lives there? What is the caste composition? What is the religion factor there? And more so religion right now, because our experience, at least my experience in communities, had showed that that slums used to be truly secular. Yeah. So now they are not, because now you see ghettoization in slums also. It probably used to be there, but not to the same extent of how, let's say, middle class or upper middle class or well-off in our society are ghettoized. Slums used to be secular, but now you see that they are not, and that determines what is the service that you get or not. Yeah. Similarly with caste. So if a slum is 20 years old and they are still living in plastic sheds that you mentioned, most likely they could be migrants. Most likely they would be people from elsewhere. Most likely they could be people even from, as they say, it could be people from Bangladesh, because they have a lot of minority communities working there, and they do not get services. They do not get any of the improvements that we are wanting. Howsoever collective they might be, they will not get those services if there are these tags that are associated to different groups. They will not get that. So that's a very interesting and a very, very important parameter to assess and study before we kind of go ahead. Last point was second last rather, because if you give these cities without showing the data and the research that you've shared, I would automatically say that Bangalore, anytime, any day, would have better services, better amenities and infrastructure, because one, the politics there is very different. Caste identity is very solid, and there has been a huge movement of Dalits in acquiring land titles, in acquiring improvements in the community, and it's actually one of the very few states where you have a very good housing policy. And a very good guideline to give land titles to informal settlements, and that's come about by these informal settlements and groups coming together and negotiating at a state level. So if you were to share that graph, I would have placed Bangalore on top. Patna would definitely be on the bottom part, because the engagement there is very different at this stage. So if I were there, I would have made those choices. Last comment was that there is this gradual improvement of informal settlements and communities that we expect, right? But increasingly more so, I don't think that is applicable in Indian cities anymore. So the shocks that you mentioned are becoming more frequent, and shocks are becoming bigger in scale. So even if it's a 30-year-old community which has land title or maybe has more proof or infrastructure, they are still getting evicted. And that I can give many examples of why, because local politics does not matter. If you're a corporator, you mean nothing. I mean, for a corporator, a slum eviction means a lot, but most of the decisions are not being taken at the corporator level. Urban governance is almost dead in India. It's being done at state, center, and elsewhere. So that is the scale that we're operating right now. Schemes like smart city. If my slum or the community that I live comes as slum in a smart city, God save the community, no? Because even if I have all the proof, there is no way that'll stand that kind of developments. Courts, again, the whole. So basically, there is a collapse of vote bank politics, so to say. So what was relevant 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is not what is there at this stage. That is our take on the ground. So those were some points and questions, Emily. I think it would be very good to kind of hear from you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Aravind. So the questions are pretty much provocative. So I'm sure that Emily will have ample time to respond to that. So let me not add anything to your comments. So just move straight forward to our next and last discussion, Dr. Sarani. Yeah.
Yeah,
Dr. Sarani, if you please
actually, actually, the benefit of speaking last is that most of the points have been raised. So it's like I will start with the formality and informality. See, whenever we talk about southern cities, informality is overwhelming now. It's not only about in slum, but outside also slum. It goes parallel with southern cities. But my experience of researching in slums is mainly confined to Kolkata. So looking at the history, what Professor Chatterjee was saying, I doubt how far the slums, the notified slums, those slums which are notified by some acts, we can tell them as an informal settlement. Yes, they are a low income settlements. They are settlements, the bastis, the bashoti, which comes from the term settlement itself. But how far we can say them as a formal, informal settlements, and that's where the ontology, the context of ontology of Professor Jenia Mukherjee comes in. That what is a squatter settlement? There is a difference. We have always studied as is that something squatter settlements, the illegal, and then there is a basti, the slums, which are notified or recognized. But these terms, notified, recognized, identified, this comes from when the first slum survey, slum enumeration was done, slum census was brought out in 2001. But the history of slums or the bastis, jhuggi jhappis goes far back. So that is one thing that because we talk about informality, which is a very fluid concept, fine, but at the same time we also need to know about the formality, the formal things. So that is one thing. But with that also I want to know that how far, even if they're formal, how far they are safe. Because what just before me Arvind was speaking out, even if they're formal settlements, they have legal titles, or they are actually very strong legal enactments that will stop them from evictions, what we are saying, because of this global corporatization and there is a land grabbing, there's a change in this legal entitlements also. The laws itself are changing. Like Thika Tenancy Act, which has been a very landmark act of protecting against eviction in West Bengal, in Calcutta, that law is itself changing. That law is not being abolished or thing, but the internal structure of that law is changing. So that is one thing, that once we are formalizing, we are saying, okay, it's legal. We have also seen what remains legal anymore, or even if the legal structure itself, the ontology of the legal is also changing or not. Because during the pandemic we have seen there has been lockdowns and things like that, but at the same time there has been much focus on how to govern the slums, because immediately it was like the slums will spread everything. So it came from that kind of fear. So slum became focused, but itself, we also seen there are lots of eviction drives which are also going on simultaneously. That work did not stop. So that is one thing. The second thing, let me continue with the informality, like you have said, raise the topic of the informal networks, how they negotiate. That is very important and relevant. But at the same time, I was thinking of how the local leaders, the local state, because these local leaders by means the local state, that is local self-government, itself push forward for a very informal kind of network. It is not only the slum dwellers who are actually pushing for the informal networks, it also for the local leaders, because somehow that even after 25 years of 74th Constitutional Amendment Act and legalization, constitutionalization of the local self-government, the state government has emerged very strong as far as the urban is concerned. So this local representatives, they push strongly because that is how they survive. I am saying this very particularly because when the pandemic happened, especially in West Bengal, it was also awaiting two very crucial elections. One is the state election, the other is the local self-election. The local self-government election, the municipal election is still awaited. So whether you will win or not, how much you will get, because that slum is a very, it's a seat of vote banks. Vote bank politics is very important in this case. There are some, the ward coordinators, the ward representatives, some of them have been exceptionally responsible, because they know by this is the time, if they push for these kinds of networks, if they push benefits this through this kind of network, they will survive. In fact, there was a from the chief minister that if you can, if the local representatives can make the MLA, elect the MLAs of their own party, they will get certain extra added benefits. If you can't, you won't get that. These kind of things, these actually push. They also go through that kind of informal networks. That's why even if a single neighborhood had 2 to 3 slums, one is notified, the other is on the railway lines or on the canal banks which are not notified, they make it a point that these kinds of benefits, at least for now, they reach. But the fact is these benefits are short-lived. I mean, you can give access to some kind of services like water supplies, or you can add construction of 2 or 3 more toilets and things like that. But they don't actually help in working conditions of the slums, whether they're living in a formal slums, whether they're living in a squatter settlements and things like that. This is one thing I was thinking of when I was talking, when you're talking of politics. The politics is not, it's a both ways. I mean, it's not only about the slum dwellers, it's also about those the local leaders, local representatives, how they play that politics and something like that. And especially in states like West Bengal and things, what we were talking of transactional, we will talk about the vote banks. It's not only about politics, it's also about the party politics. So it's when the some benefits is reaching to the slums, even if it's a soap, even it's some kind of sanitizing things, it is not reaching from the state, it's reaching from the party. So which party is giving what kind of benefits and things like that. So that part is, I find very interesting how that dynamics plays out. And the second thing is regarding, you have taken 3 cities from 3 states. That is very interesting because they are very different states, as already told by Professor Chatterjee. But I was also thinking, if you could take up the slums of towns and cities, or the smaller cities of the same state. Like in West Bengal, everything is visible as far as Kolkata and Kolkata metropolis is concerned. What about those smaller cities or the smaller towns? They are not as visible. I bet they are more vulnerable because they are less visible. And what happens to those? So because you are going for a comparative approach, both Jaipur, Patna, they are state capitals, all the 3s, and Bangalore is a very well off, I mean, it's a good, large metropolitan area. But I was thinking of other towns, smaller towns in Karnataka or in Rajasthan. What kind of dynamics, what kind of vulnerability on informal networks just plays out? I was just curious to know that. And this is the only thing. Okay, fine.
Can I add something in
Yeah.
case of networking?
Ma'am, if you please,
Yeah.
very brief and quick point,
Very
ma'am.
briefly, very briefly.
Yes,
Talking
2 minutes, ma'am.
Talking about networks and others, there is a study by Professor Arup Mitro. It is about 4 cities, Ludhiana, Mathura, Ujjaini and Jaipur. Jaipur is there. And there he talks about the nexus between networking and castes. And he said that the so-called SCs and STs, they could get much less from the network as can be availed by the general caste. General caste, that is a very interesting point. Usually we think that the people in the lower rung, they want to conglomerate more, they want to network more, but this study shows just the different thing, that the general caste, they get more from the networking in the slums.
Oh, so well, thank you. I think now Dr. Emily has a lot of questions to answer. Well, just before moving over to Dr. Emily, I'm just seeing some very interesting questions which is there in your Q&A box. The first one is related to the measurement of these strength of informal networks and negotiations. So these are very crucial. So it is written that is that based on the outcome? So this is question number 1. Second question is another important question: the role of land developers in all these political negotiations that you were talking about. Because I can remember the very influential work of Lisa Winstein, which is on the Mumbai. There was an urban entrepreneur, Mukesh Mehta, how he navigated the entire political scenario to shape the reformulation of the Dharavi. And so that's a very important question. And the third one is, again, so this is the classic text article by Ananya Roy, that's on informality. So how does your research look at slum and informality? So these are 3 very important questions. Now it's over to you to answer to all the queries and the points which have raised by our discussion. It's over to you, Emily.
Well, thank you all so much for an incredible set of questions and discussion points. Where are we? How are we doing on time? I'm wondering how long I should respond for.
I think it's up to you. Like, if you want to answer all the questions, or rather, you please choose the questions that you want to answer.
Okay, yeah, because I was taking a bunch of notes, you probably noticed. Yeah. So I'll respond to what I can. But yeah, this was a fascinating, incredible set of responses. Thank you all so much. I think that a lot of the themes that were touched on were common, and let me kind of go through my notes a little bit and speak to the ones that I've thought a bit more about. All right, so I think one thing that came up quite a bit was on defining slums, defining informality, and these different categories, and how these different categories will also differ across cities. So there's a few things to say about that. First of all, it was raised that these cities are going to be completely different in some ways because they have different policies. And I want to highlight that that's absolutely correct, right? There's a very clearly delineated policy in place in Bangalore for how slums are supposed to become notified and after becoming notified, eventually get property rights. Now I say clearly delineated because what happens in practice and on paper are different, and I'm happy to talk about that. But then you look at Patna and there's no slum policy in Bihar. And so of course, then you're going to have a very different set of understandings about what property rights even mean and what you're negotiating for. So I guess I'll say that we chose these 3 very different cities on purpose so that we would have a broad range of cities to look at with a broad range of slums. And at the time, we didn't know whether we would see different types of slums in different cities, whether we would see some sort of continuum like this. And really the goal was to just select 3 very different Indian cities and see, when we use this type of satellite approach, what do we actually find the range of needs are, and dig in, keep digging in from there. What I showed you really intentionally kind of lumped everything together because we were trying to make a more general statement about slums span this range of conditions, and I want to make some somewhat generalizable statements about the ways in which people experience and respond to informalities across these spaces. That was intentional. I agree that every slum in every city is different. And to really be able to perfectly explain behavior and, living conditions, you have to dig into much more local level detail to understand. But for the current goal of creating a broader set of conclusions about how people experience and respond to informalities, we kind of wanted to zoom out a little bit. Now, that all said, I have done a bit of zooming in on certain topics. And so I actually have a paper that will come out soon that might be of interest to some of the panelists, that's specifically looking at how slums in Patna are a bit different from the other slums. And it was mentioned in the introduction, I lived in Bihar for 2 years actually, so I have this tendency to keep wanting to study Patna slums, even though of course they're going to be different from slums in these other cities. But there, weaker property rights, there's extreme history of land conflict and tension. There's history of landlessness among lower caste groups. I mean, there's a lot that's unique to Bihar and also not unique that we write about in that paper. And so I guess what I'm getting at there is that to some extent, we want to have a generalizable discussion about informalities spanning this important spectrum within each city. The spectrum of informality is going to look different. So maybe it's easier to get water access in one city and not the other. Maybe it's easier to get property documents in Bangalore where there's a clear policy and not in Patna. But we intentionally lump them into this index to try to just get it first. How are people responding to informalities? Some work will dig deeper into the local conditions, like the Patna paper that I'm looking at. Another project I'm thinking of starting is looking at actually across these 3 cities. I expect vote banks to matter to differing degrees, or the relationship between the strength of a vote bank and access to quality water to differ depending on the city. And so that's something that I want to then dig into. Well, in Bangalore, the water is provided by the state. There's different water provision levels versus state versus municipal or mixed across 3 cities. And how does that affect then how locally politically mediated these are? So I'm kind of rambling. The point is to say we intentionally pick these very 3 cities to make generalizable claims, but you could always dig in deeper and deeper to these very idiosyncratic differences, which I do think are very important. And if you were to create a city specific index, it would look different in each place, if that makes sense. On the point about the different types of slums and what do we even think slums are. So I kind of gave all that backstory because that's going to also differ by city, right? So one thing that was puzzling to us early on was that we weren't really finding correlations between notified slums in Bangalore and many other different outcomes. So there's some literature that says notified slums, or these there are slums there's these 3 types of slums: those that are completely off the lists. Then there are these identified, where the government will be aware that they exist and they're documented somewhere, but they're not legally notified as a slum. And then, at least in Bangalore, the terminology is that there's notification. And if they become notified, then that's when they're legally supposed to be provided with services and can apply for individual property documents. But we just weren't finding robust correlations between notification and service access or these property documents. And so we actually did an in-depth study in Bangalore where we looked into this further, and we did a housing inquiry where we looked specifically at all the different types of housing documents residents showed us that they had. And we were able to find 18 different housing documents prevalent in the slums in our sample that we could arrange along a continuum of bestowing more or less security or tenure security. So there were these type 1 slums type 1 papers, we call them, type 2 and type 3, and the different types. And each of those 18 papers could be clustered within those 3 types. And the 3 types were increasing in the amount of security that residents believed that they had protection from eviction, as well as were associated with higher property values in the informal transactions that were going on. But these are supposed to be provided, like I said, along this very clearly delineated process where one type of paper is given before notification, but then the notification process would begin and you get the next type, and only after notification do you get the final type. But we see that this is really happening out of order depending on the local political connections of the settlement. And so even in a place like Bangalore, where you have a clear policy, what happens on the ground appears to be very much negotiated by the local informal networks, but also not necessarily, or it does require some local knowledge to understand then, because it was confusing that we didn't see necessarily that notified slums were the ones with better services. We do see that those with higher paper types have better services, but you don't necessarily get the paper types in order of how the process is supposed to go on paper. So in terms of these different types of slums, registered, recognized, identified, kind of stayed away from looking at those different categorizations because I think there's just so much ambiguity and complexity on the ground in reality. Speaking then to though, what are the differences between those and what I'm considering as my definition of slums? So we actually, because we wanted to get around the formal data or the official data sources, what we did was we used the satellite images to locate, essentially look at the physical characteristics of certain areas, right? And so we could, like I mentioned, we can see whether there are roads, we can see the housing size, materials, we can see these physical characteristics. The UN has these 5 indicators that they use as these to denote or to locate a slum area anywhere around the world. And those are, as I mentioned, have to do with whether or not the area has adequate water, sanitation, whether the area is super overcrowded, whether the housing's durable, and then tenure, whether or not they have property rights. So the purpose of using the satellite images was essentially to get at those 4 of which are physical, visible characteristics. And then when we ground truthed, we went and asked about property rights. So we asked, when we were building the sample, we asked about whether or not then they did have those infrastructure characteristics, but also do most of the people in the area have property documents? And it was based, when we were ground truthing and picking our sample, it was based on those UN indicators of both physical deprivations and whether or not residents lacked on whether they largely lacked these property documents. So we were then agnostic to whether we were calling them squatter settlements, whether we were considering them as, notified, as we asked about those things, certainly, but when we were building the sample, it was just based on these physical deprivations and do most people not have property rights? And so what we end up with then is that when I show that continuum, I'm really glad that this was asked about, because when I'm showing that continuum graph, that includes what would be considered squatter settlements, as well as what would be considered rehabilitated slum areas or notified slum areas, because we're spanning essentially any area that has these physical deprivations of overcrowding and poor quality housing, lack of water and sanitation, and where the residents lack individual property rights. So the settlement might be notified at the group level, it might not be. The residents might be considered squatters, they might not be. But then that way we capture that wide range of living condition, or we capture the range of settlements that just have those deprivations recognized by the United Nations. And so I think it was really important then to clarify that, yeah, many of those are going to be undocumented, because many of them are going to be smaller squatter settlements that wouldn't be counted by the census because they might be less than 300 people, which is like the minimum cutoff according to the Indian government, right? So the point of that spectrum is that we're going from the most vulnerable squatters all the way to settlements where I showed a picture where there were apartment towers, and that's a rehabilitated in situ developed slum area, but residents still consider themselves slum residents. They have documents that say it's a slum. And this gets into what some of the feedback was as well, well, when does that become a formal settlement? And I think I think that's somewhere that's a little bit blurry. Like the upper end of that continuum does start to blend into formal, but perhaps lower income areas. And we're really trying to get at that the lists, when they do exist, need to be updated so that slums eventually get removed when they no longer experience one of those deprivations. But that we're getting kind of on that continuum all the way up to those that would be just about, should be taken off the slum list, essentially. All right, let's see. I wanted to, because I was just talking about the satellite images, also get back to the point that it can be really tricky to use Google Earth. So this note here. I think here I wrote down in my notes, this is exactly why we need to triangulate. So absolutely, you know, I wouldn't be comfortable using the images to say, here's a map of slums in the city without then also asking people about, like I just said, property rights, or double checking that that's not actually, you know, something that just looks like a slum, because, you know, it turns out there are, you know, markets that can look like slum areas. Outside of India, actually cemeteries I've seen in other cities when I've looked at images, they look like slum areas. So, you know, definitely you can have some false positives when you're using the satellite images. And I think that that's absolutely the, we're not at a point where we can just use satellite images to understand slums at all. And I don't know if we'll ever be, but I think it is a good tool to try to at least start to locate those that are perhaps otherwise undocumented in a systematic manner, to then go in and have these more detailed discussions. So I do think that's important to point out. And different cities look different. So Patna, for example, where some official estimates are that only 3% live in slums. Actually, the whole city, when you look at Google Earth, is pretty much looks like a slum. It's hard to differentiate because the city is so dense and in many places unplanned. And so, yes, there are differences citywide in where you can actually determine what looks like a slum, which also gets me thinking about, and to respond to some of the points about, well, what about smaller towns? Which are, I'm glad that those were raised, that people brought up smaller towns, because most of the urbanization going forward is going to occur in these smaller town areas, where I suspect we will see a lot of people living under these slum type conditions, but there will be a different politics. And I'm glad that that was brought up, because I think that's a really important area for future work. We have not done any surveys in these smaller town areas, and I suspect that it'll be harder to locate distinctive slum areas from satellite images in those spaces, and that there will be different political negotiations and more neglect, but that's something that I think really needs to be studied, especially going forward. Let me see. Another thing that I remember coming up quite a bit is identity within the slums. So caste, religion, gender. So yes, I want to speak about that a little bit. So interestingly, so yes, so first of all, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes are overrepresented in all of the slums across the 3 cities relative to the demographics of the city in non-slum areas. So that's obviously no coincidence. But one thing that, you know, we've looked at religion and caste in looking at least in how areas are organizing, and not found systematic differences in the quantitative data. I think where we would find really important differences is in who gets responded to, which neighborhoods get more favorable responses or not, based on my interviews. So, you know, caste comes up a lot in the interviews. You know, in some areas, you know, I'll hear people saying, well, we're Dalits, so they're not gonna do that for us. Caste has also come up in, somebody mentioned, I think, caste activism in Bangalore, and that actually has also come up quite a bit in interviews, where I've seen caste advocacy organizations coming in and helping certain neighborhoods organize, which has actually led to an increase in the strength of the informal network and has set off a trajectory of political engagement. So I think there's a lot there's a lot more to learn about both when do perhaps coalitions potentially form across different neighborhoods, which could potentially happen in Bangalore, where I'm seeing a bit of caste coalition protests, for example, like neighborhoods protesting together organized by certain neighborhoods that I haven't necessarily seen in the other cities. I think it's important to consider who's responded to, like I said, and I mentioned that work that I'm doing now is trying to understand that part of the feedback loop. So not just how do, after people organize, who's responded to, and I think caste will be very important there. Within neighborhoods, I actually haven't yet picked up on important differences in who is served by the area leaders. And so Adam Orbach and Tariq Thachil have a bunch of work where they're actually writing about how in urban slums in India, you see a lot of cross-caste, inter-caste coalitions because of this type of vote bank politics, where it serves the neighborhoods to work together, or it serves different caste groups to mobilize together, and it doesn't serve the area leaders and brokers to discriminate against caste groups because they build a following based on a broader reputation. So that's something that's pretty interesting to follow. And I do have one paper where I'm looking at which neighborhoods are better organizing. So which ones are more likely to have this social cohesion. And I don't find differences. We don't find that areas are less socially cohesive when they're more diverse, but the difference, we see areas that appear to be weaker vote banks or less organized when there's greater economic inequality between caste groups. We don't see that when there's economic inequality in the neighborhood or when there's diversity in the neighborhood, but when there's inequality between caste groups, it seems to exacerbate and make more salient caste identity in a way that's making mobilization in those spaces that's hindering that. So there's a lot of interesting things to look at with caste, and some of them I think are contrary perhaps to expectation, which is what Tariq and Adam's work is really getting at. But I haven't found, I think I'll find more when I look at who's getting a response. On gender, this is also something that I'm very interested in, and this is something where I see more of a difference within neighborhood and who's getting, or who's active and who's being responded to or not. I have another paper where I look at women's differences in men and women's political engagement within slum spaces. And someone mentioned that actually women are, I think it was Professor Chatterjee mentioned women. It surprised her how women were very vocal in some of the slums that she'd been to. And this is something that I have found that women and men participate at equal rates in slums when they're engaging in these types of vote bank behaviors. So when there is a leader organized protest, or when they're asked to sign petitions to give to politicians, that really are the purpose is to maximize or show the size of this vote bank or the strength of this vote bank. Women are participating at equal rates, at least when you control for other characteristics like education levels and such, which women tend to be less privileged on. But they are much less represented in the informal leadership. There's way fewer female brokers. So these area leaders who negotiate tend to be male. They're very heavily male dominated. The internal meetings where leadership decisions are taken are heavily male dominated. And then in going outside of the neighborhood, in choosing a group of representatives to go make claims, that's also very much a male oriented activity. So that's something that I'm quite interested in as well, and really interested in understanding whether female and male leaders take on different tasks. So again, that's come up in interviews, but I haven't been able to look at systematically in the quantitative data yet. But I have heard in some interviews people talking about how female leaders, when they're present, will help more with issues of domestic violence or child marriage in ways that I don't hear people talking about male leaders working on. So I think there's a lot to unpack there as well. Let me take a look at my other notes. These were really great. I think another point that I wanted to have the opportunity to touch on was there's this, this point again of, some residents are citizens, they have the right to the city. And one thing that I wanted to flag was that's something that really amazed me when in my interviews was the diversity with which, or the variation with which people referred to themselves as citizens of the city or not. So I kind of mentioned that I mentioned that in some of the photos I showed earlier in the presentation, that in this very informal neighborhood, residents were describing themselves, despite having lived there for 20, 30 years, as not city dwellers. You know, they said, well, they described themselves as peripheral to the city. And it was then there was another neighborhood that was it was similarly, there were similar characteristics, and they started out the same way. They looked the same way, the same characteristics. And at the part of what I enjoyed about doing in-depth interviews was asking about changes over time. And people actually said, well, you know, nobody would even know we were a citizen of India back then, and described themselves previously as peripheral. And now that they'd received this recognition and these resources, they were saying, well, now we can show, like, we are citizens of Bangalore. We have the right, or they need to be providing things for us. And so this even self-description I found fascinating, the difference in that. But I also think that there's a huge, you know, there's huge misconceptions about who lives in slums and whether or not they're migrants and whether or not they are planning to remain in the city for a long time, which I think policymakers can take as an excuse to not necessarily serve these neighborhoods, because they're not only are slums undercounted, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions that they're very transient. They're going to convert into non-slum areas eventually. That this is all just a temporary thing, and you can, you know, there's all this old literature that Professor Chatterjee also mentioned that there's this, you know, old literature from the World Bank but others as well that said slums are temporary, and actually the present, you know, Ed Glazer also says at one point said the presence of slums today bodes well for growth tomorrow, because it means that the city's developing. And, you know, the research is just not bearing that out. We see instead that residents live in slums for multiple generations and experience very little upward mobility, and then are consistently pulled down with downward shocks as well. And so I think when first of all, when the data say that there are fewer slums than there actually are, and when there are misconceptions that people are living there temporarily and perhaps have some village to go back to or want to go back to, then it's, I think, easier for them to turn an eye. And so I think, I just wanted to reflect on that, I guess, because I think I just think there are a lot of misconceptions about how temporary they are, and they are indeed urban citizens who want to stay there and need these resources. Let's see. I think, again, there were so many good points, but I've already babbled on and on. I do want to make sure to touch on a couple more though. So then another point was on the importance of state politics and what happens when you have smart cities plans coming in. And I actually wanted to touch on that because and this idea that the shocks are going to become more frequent and deeper. And I did want to reflect on what I've seen on that in Patna, which is that we've surveyed 43 slums in Patna in 2016. And at the time, like I said, very weak property rights, but most people didn't feel very concerned about eviction. Then prior to the pandemic starting, I guess 2018, 2019, was returning to these spaces, and everyone was worried about eviction. And so the rhetoric then in every place that I revisited was smart cities, smart cities, smart cities. People are getting evicted. It's only a matter of time until they come to evict us. Now, when that happened, we realized, well, so when that happened, we started following up with the leaders there and checking on whether or not they'd been evicted, and we're planning on going and following up. Before the pandemic started, about 25% of our sample had been evicted, had been displaced. And so we were going to then go follow up and see where have they gone and such, but then the pandemic started, and I have not been to India since the pandemic began. But we have been calling the area leaders, and actually, despite concerns that evictions would continue to happen during the pandemic or even ramp up, we actually did see a pause in Patna, at least in our sample. And so I just flagged that to say, yes, slum residents were talking about the Smart Cities plan. They were concerned about the Smart Cities plan. And that's something that we're going to continue to study further to try and get at, well, what are the political determinants, or what are the characteristics from our baseline data of which ones ended up getting evicted or not? And can we see anything with that, with the local political networks, or is this just going to turn into a state story and there's not necessarily systematic predictors of which areas get evicted? So that is something that, if you're interested, stay tuned, I'm working on. Let's see. And then the last, The last thing I think I'll touch on is this question about where land developers figure into this. And so, yeah, I think relatedly, that's a really good point. And that's not something that I've considered explicitly. And that's more something that I'm thinking about now when we're thinking about smart cities and such. But that is something that when I'm looking at how people are engaging, I'm not considering whether or not land development figures into that. I do suspect it'll figure into which neighborhoods receive benefits. And so part of what we're looking at with Patna 2 is the land value of the areas that are getting evicted or not. But that's something that was, still deserves more attention. I think I'll stop there.
No, well, thank you. So you have almost covered almost all the questions and comments which have been raised by our discussants and panels. And I'm just saying that Dr. Ratullah Kundu has joined this panel. So, well, thank you for joining Dr. Ratullah. She is associated with the Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai. So if you want to, please come in and share some of your comments. Please, it's over to you, Dr. Ratullah.
Oh, thank you, Shomadeep, and thank you, Emily. That's a fascinating presentation, I said, and to all the panelists there, I don't want to sort of bring up any more complexities because I think it was quite a rich presentation, but it does strike me, Emily, as there's been a lot of talk around this idea of vote bank politics, this kind of patron-client relationship that you sort of seem to sense. Now, beyond that, what are these negotiations really about? Is it, so I would really like it if, at some point in your work, you can sort of shed some light on the nature of negotiations. Because it seems to me that in some way, because of the graph, everything is kind of moving towards formalization. Whereas I would say that, many of these negotiations might not end up with formalization. They might actually get into a kind of a sticky situation where nothing really happens over years and years of negotiations. So, just keeping in mind that graph, it's kind of giving off that sense that, things move in that direction, but it may not. And so just to keep that in mind, how do you keep that in play when you think of the different kinds of negotiations that happen and who the different actors are involved? So just to leave that there. I'm not expecting an answer, but this came up while you were describing it. But anyway, kudos to you for having covered so much ground and just contributes to all the work that my fellow panelists and colleagues at one point of time have talked about. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ratullah. So, and if yes, again, it's Dr. Emily, if you want to respond very briefly.
Sure. Yeah, I think that is an important point, and I don't want to give off in any sense that there's an automatic conversion over time into this completely formal area into these completely formal areas, because most of the time there's not. And at least in the paper version, what I try to make clear is this is what I'm expecting at a given point in time. So at a given point in time, there will be these different neighborhood characteristics, and depending on depending on the characteristics at that point in time, I expect different behaviors. I'm working on a book project in the longer term where I'm trying then to unpack why do some settlements get set off on a virtuous sort of cycle versus a vicious stuck cycle, because that absolutely happens. And we very rarely see slums converting into completely formal areas. And so I do think that there's going to be there's quite a bit of a drop off at some point, because at some point, politicians have incentives to be providing to someone informal spaces because they actually are trying to promote this dependency. And informal leaders as well benefit from having the power of engaging in these negotiations. So at some point, there's actually some, I think, perverse incentives around moving beyond that kind of the last, not even the last mile, maybe the last 10 miles of the, of that spectrum. But discussing those dynamics, I'm glad you flagged, is important and is something that I'm working on unpacking. And I'll try to make clearer going forward when I present that's a cross-sectional graph, and that much more work is needed to understand who gets, what sets these trajectories in motion, and how do you get from one path
it's also
to another.
possibly, contingent on spatio-temporal dynamics, because at particular points, particular coalitions might work, and particular spaces are valued versus not so valued. And I think that those kind of characteristics, when they come into play, it's that contingency factor that plays in. So it's hard to sort of pin down exactly, what works and what doesn't work. Dharavi itself, I think Lisa's book says, the durability of the slum belies every kind of effort to sort of redevelop it, and, every attempt at redeveloping it over the last 10, 15 years. But then it's also to do with the kind of market dynamics that plays out in Mumbai, which may not be similar to other cities. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really great point.
Well, thank you. And now just let me invite the IMPRI Director Arjun for your comments.
Sir, I would say we can go to the way forward round. 1 minute to each of the panelists. I just wanted to add a few things we missed. That Emily ma'am, how do you see the role of technology as has been practiced over the world, and you are also using satellite imagery. So how do you see that what we can use to improve our slums or relocate them? And one of the most important part was the rental housing in the slums also, because there is some migrant issue is coming, and then some kind of shadow and other things. And for this improvement, there is also a lot of gestation period, and it takes a lot of time and business as usual. Do you have any way forward for Indian cities to come over this illness in our urban domain? And some policy related matters, but everyone knows that we have Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban. In that the slum component is really very meager, 5% only houses. We have sanctioned more than 11 million houses. So those things let us leave, but now let us move to way forward round.
Yeah.
So that we cover, who would like to go first? Samadip said
Professor Chatterjee. Yes.
Mahalaya ma'am, yes.
About
1 minute, Mahaladi.
No, actually, what I want to say that this is a very interesting thing, and many things can be brought in if a resurvey is done. One can, of course, look into the of the state's initiative and other things, and as I have said, the gendered component and everything can be brought into in this very important thing. And another point is about informality, that as this in our system, it takes a long time. It's a long time to formalize anything, including the slums. One should keep in mind in that. And shall I respond to Arvind's comment that West Bengal is way back in giving land title?
No, ma'am. It will take much more time. So
okay, Arvind.
We will have another panel on that.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So thank you, Mahaladi, for your comments. And now let me move over to Dr. Jenia for your comments. Maybe a brief 1 or 2 minutes.
Yes, I think thanks, Emily, for this presentation really, and this work, because I was just checking your articles, and I find your article recently, I think in 2019, published in Environment and Urbanization, very, very interesting. I think again, the way you have put the methodology section and the way you have counted the slum scores. So I'm quite fascinated with your methodology approach. So I think my suggestion would be, as Ratula also mentioned, about some works by Roy and Ananda Roy, and also why it is important to decouple, slum from informality, because a whole lot of discussion is going on in that linear direction. So how to insert more non-linearities and complexities, in this entire understanding. So, and I don't know, I'm not sure, but whether, it will be more fruitful for you if you can also complement your methodology with qualitative insights that, that political ecologists, or for that matter, other urban scholars had used or are still using.
So yeah, thank you, Dr. Jenia. Now it's over to Mr. Aravind. Are you there? Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm there. Nothing much to.
I think you are not audible, Aravind. Is there any
It
network
froze.
issue? Network issue?
Yes, I think Arvind's video froze. We can move to next.
Okay, so it's Dr. Sarani.
Actually, just wanted to say one thing only, that you said these three cities are very different. I mean, this is, I think it's a positive thing, as we, if you want to look forward, that not only these three cities, the entire, it's very heterogeneous and diverse cyber urbanization we have. And that is a very positive thing. I mean, even though there are policies like, or missions like Genuine or Smart City mission, where we are trying to homogenize and show urbanization as a very homogenized process, it's a very good thing that we still have that kind of diverse fact, where every cities are different. Even within cities there are there are so much differences. So to me, as long as this kind of differences or diversity in urbanization is there, and it is also good for us, our researchers, we have got much more better prospect for working on those things. So that is the only thing. Thank you.
Thanks for Dr. Sarani. And Dr. Rotula, if you again want to add something very briefly.
Nothing much to add. I look forward to her papers, and really one of the best things about this is how you position agency, and it's clearly within the negotiated nature of agency of slum dwellers. And what would be really nice to know is when that works, when that falls apart, how and under what conditions that really makes a difference in their lives. So it would be really nice to read up. So all the best on your future endeavors.
Right, Arvind is back. Arvind, over to you.
Yeah. Last comment was that love the research. Sorry that I ended up could not comment. So love the research. I think more inquiry on the qualitative aspects which you mentioned that you're doing or have done in Patna. I think we'll look forward to that and would love to kind of read up on that. That's it. Congrats for the work done.
Yes, thank you, Abhinay. Actually, we started this panel with a 75 minutes duration, but already we have 9 plus so, and many issues are coming. So I think we need another couple, not one panel, another couple of panels to deliberate on all those intricate issues. And as I have seen that this informal governance, whatever in India in practice, is in stark contrast to the formal governance regimes in India. So, but there is very scant, or rather, I should say, the non-acknowledgement of such informal aspects, which have resulted in some sort of cosmetic changes in the situation only. And this does not bode well for the reduction in the vulnerabilities and increase in resilience of the cities in the near future. So what I think that there is an imperative to recognize the integral relationship and the contribution of slums and the informal settlements and economy to the nature of urbanism, which India has been experiencing. And then serious attempts should be made to understand the conditions of life and how to redress those vulnerabilities of the settlements. So we need a lot more research, a lot more panel discussions on this. And I'm hopeful that IMPRI will continue to do these sorts of panel discussion to shed much more light on unraveling this black box of informalities of the Indian urban governance system and Indian urban planning system. So with this, let me now request Dr. Arjun to formally propose our the vote of thanks.
For some last word to Emily, ma'am, would you like to add anything?
Would you like to add anything?
Sure. So I just wanted to say thanks again for everything, but also I'm happy that there's been several people in the last round express interest in the qualitative work as well, because that's something that that I'm really, relying on heavily in this discussion of how do slum residents talk about their own agency and their, what do these characteristics mean for their beliefs about their own citizenship. And so I'm actually relying quite heavily on the qualitative bit in things that will be coming out going forward. So I'm happy to hear that people want to see that. So Dr. Kumar, you asked about how can we use technology going forward? And I just want to note that I do think that there are some important applications for technology. So one is that there was discussion of environmental justice issues, and I know that some people are using GIS to map more environmentally hazardous areas, and that are more environmentally vulnerable areas, and that is where you're more likely to see slum residents coming up or slums coming up. And so I think that using shapefiles or GIS, so that these tools can be used to identify potentially vulnerable spaces where we might see slums coming up, but also then think about what's going to happen with changes going forward with climate change. I know that there's quite a bit of interest in that people are using technology to look at some of these aspects of vulnerability. One way that I want to use technology going forward is looking at changes over time. So it's very hard, we have a bunch of survey data now that captures cross sections, but because we can see these physical deprivations in at least in some urban areas or in some slum areas from the satellite images, then because Google Earth shows 20 years of images, we could then look pretty systematically at development trajectories. So one thing that I'm going to be trying to look at is, at least with the sample I've already created, how can I leverage that free imagery over time to look at how things have been changing? So I just wanted to touch on those questions. And actually, I guess I'll just leave it there. This was a really fun discussion, and I'm really happy to have met all the panelists and look forward to staying in touch about all of this.
Great. And we also did some work with Dr. Abhinav Alakshendra, you must be knowing. We got a grant from International Growth Center. So for Patna, we have done a lot of those studies. I will share with you. So nonetheless,
please.
Yes, Samedeep sir, would you like to propose a vote of thanks? Yes. Samedeep sir?
Well, Arjun, you please propose.
Okay, thank you. So thank you everyone for joining this very interesting deliberation today under our series, The State of Cities, #City Conversation, organized by IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies. And today's deliberation very important, and so we almost crossed our time by so much, on negotiating informality, a range of policy needs and problem-solving strategies in urban slums. And we really focused on India today. And our speaker for today, Dr. Emily Rains, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for bearing with us, and excellent lecture of yours. I'm also thankful to all of our discussants, Professor Mahalaya, ma'am, Dr. Jenia, ma'am, Dr. Sarani, ma'am, Aravind, of course, also supporting us in all our urban works, and all our other, Ratula, ma'am, also, and all of our participants who were here on Zoom and who were watching at Facebook Live and would later watch at YouTube and our other podcast. And thank you, all of you, and also thank you, Swamedeep sir and IMPRI team. And I wish you a very nice day and good evening to everyone here in India. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night. And good day, Dr.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.